Welcome to the 2019 ACSI Annual Conference. I'm Ali Moore and I'll be your MC for what promises to be an absolutely packed day of conversations and plenty of opportunity for you to join those conversations during the Q&A sessions. Unfortunately, Uncle Colin Hunter from the Wurundjeri Tribe Land and Compensation Cultural Heritage Council is unwell this morning and couldn't join us for the Welcome to Country. But I would like to start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It really doesn't get much more timely than this for a discussion about creating sustainable long-term value. If it wasn't for the small matter of the federal election in just 10 days' time, I'm guessing that the fallout from the Royal Commission would still be dominating the front pages. And in fact, even with the election, it's still pretty prominent in daily reporting. One of our speakers later this morning on the directors panel has been making headlines telling directors to do better. And Graham Samuel, who'll join us this afternoon, has also made headlines with his commentary on director clubs with the top of his follow-up opinion piece titled, "OMG, what have I done?" And he'll tell us exactly what he's done a little later today. And of course, ACSI's own Ian Silk is all over the newspapers today, and you'll hear from him in just a moment. At the same time, ACSI has put out a series of policy proposals, all of which go to the heart of how we build better ESG outcomes. ACSI would like to thank the conference sponsors, in particular Austbil Investments, who are the Platinum event partner for 2019. All our speakers today will be thanked for their contribution with a donation to the Cure Brain Cancer Foundation. And please do follow today's discussion on Twitter using the hashtag ACSIConf. I'd now like to welcome Ian Silk to give the opening address. Ian is, of course, President of ACSI. He's also Chief Executive of Australian Super, where he's responsible for the leadership and strategic direction of the fund. He's also Director of Industry Super Australia and also Basketball Australia. Please welcome Ian Silk.
Thank you, Ali, and good morning, everyone. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's fantastic to see such a huge crowd. This is a record crowd for an ACSI conference. 350 odd people. I remember several years ago we used to have it in a much smaller venue. There'd be a much smaller number of people, and we'd say that was terrific because it was a nice, dedicated, niche sort of group. But frankly, we've now got a grown-up conference, so that's great. When we had the conference last year, which itself was a record in terms of attendance, it was in the midst of the Royal Commission, the Hayne Royal Commission. And the Royal Commission has proven, and hopefully will have ongoing effects, but already it's proven to have had significant effects on the financial services industry and broader corporate Australia. For me, some of the most powerful comments made by the Royal Commissioner were in his interim report, which was released in November ahead of the final report, which was released earlier this year. And in that interim report, he said, "Don't expect in the final report I'm going to propose a wholesale rewriting of the corporate law framework in this country. Because whilst it can be improved, it's basically okay. What's required is two things. Firstly, for corporate Australia to obey the law. And secondly, when that doesn't happen, for regulators to vigorously enforce the law." I think by implication, there was a third point being made there, and that is that the owners and the investors and the shareholders in corporate Australia have a role to play as well. If we acknowledge that there are shortcomings in the practices in corporate Australia, the regulators, at least at that point, weren't as vigorously as they might have been enforcing the law, then there is another party who has a role in the game. And I think that's worth reflecting on through the course of today as we listen to the fantastic panel of speakers that Louise and her team have organised for us. The fact that we've got so many people here today is, I think, reflective of the increasing interest in the role of ESG factors in investing. And that increasing interest, not surprisingly, has precipitated some resistance to that. And I want to talk a little bit about that resistance. One of the main contentions of those who oppose the role of ESG in investing is that we're breaching obligations by considering those ESG factors and that we should stay in our lane. These views represent a misunderstanding of how and why ESG factors should be considered in investment decisions. Let me be clear, we are not social engineers. We are investors and owners. Investors and owners who have a sufficiently sophisticated and nuanced view of investing to recognise that ESG factors have a material impact on the economic value of the investments that we make. The primary responsibility for super funds is to provide the best long-term investment performance for members. And of course, the key contribution to that objective will be the successful long-term economic performance of investee companies. Not economic performance at any cost, but achieved in the context of the application of appropriate ESG considerations that have an eye to the long term and to community expectations. We say that if companies or their investors were to ignore ESG factors, that would be to the long-term detriment of the economic value of those companies and, by extension, to the millions of Australians invested in them, including through their superannuation funds. I'd like to set the record straight and say why ESG integration is an important part of mainstream investing and therefore important to the success of Australia's retirement system, and why our focus on ESG risks and opportunities should grow stronger. In other words, why ESG is directly in our lane. We're the custodians of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of members' retirement savings. And there is a positive connection between better company performance on ESG issues and better investment outcomes for members. And because of this, we actively exercise those rights and responsibilities that come with being a large asset owner. ESG issues should always be integrated into any investment decisions that we make. Let's start with the law. Superannuation funds must act in the best interests of members. The law is unequivocal in this respect. For most people, retirement is a long way off. And even then, a retiree will be hoping to live for 20, 30, maybe 40 years. This is reflected in the investment horizons of ACSI members, which are focused on long-term sustainable returns. There is plenty of evidence to show that companies with poor ESG practices and performance don't do well in the long term. Failure to properly manage ESG risk can lead to reputational damage, regulatory scrutiny, civil and criminal litigation, profit downgrades and more, and ultimately to poor investment results. Clearly then, taking steps to improve companies' ESG performance is in members' best interests. I'd go one step further and say that any superannuation fund that does not consider ESG factors is breaching their best interest duty. The community has every right to be concerned about the ability of companies to review and improve their conduct. ASIC, interestingly, recently took aim at the culture of resistance and reluctance among certain financial services organisations in their response to the Royal Commission report, noting, quote, "The industry has not made as much progress as we would have liked," unquote. The public is also rightly concerned about the ability of the regulators to police corporate Australia. Royal Commissioner Hayne observed that too often financial services entities that broke the law were not properly held to account. Those of you who were at the ACSI conference last year may recall we had ASIC Chair James Shipton, and he said, and I quote, "In addition to the regulatory and enforcement roles of ASIC, it is essential that investors, and particularly organisations like ACSI that represent them, focus their efforts on also holding industry to account for malpractice, malfeasance or unacceptable harm to members," unquote. The corporate regulator itself is among those calling on institutional investors to appropriately hold companies in which we invest to account. The short-term outlook that too often characterises Australian politics means that market settings don't always reflect ESG risks and opportunities. An example of this is the energy and climate policy uncertainty that has plagued Australia for more than a decade. Investors need regulatory certainty to deploy capital, and this has delayed much-needed investment in projects to support the transition to a low-carbon economy. Climate change is a significant challenge for much of corporate Australia and readily acknowledged as such by many companies. In recent times, all three of Australia's financial regulators, APRA, ASIC and the Reserve Bank, have acknowledged the significance of climate change risk to monetary policy, financial stability and the global economy. Self-evidently then, climate change is a significant consideration for investors. And you'll have observed in the conference program that we have two of those regulators, two senior officials from those regulators appearing today, and we'll get a further insight into their views about the environmental risk that a poor approach to climate change represents. ACSI has nearly 2 decades experience in identifying and managing ESG risks and opportunities. We undertake, on your behalf, hundreds of engagement meetings with listed companies each year. Our engagement activities are underpinned by evidence-based analysis and research. Australia lags behind many developed countries when it comes to regulating ESG integration. Advocacy to improve our regulatory settings is another important part of ACSI's work. And most recently, ACSI has developed a suite of policy proposals designed to strengthen corporate accountability, culture and diversity and investment stewardship. If implemented, they will enhance the long-term value of investments by the whole community. So for all the reasons I've mentioned, and more ESG integration is in our lane, and we're not pulling over because we're needed now more than ever to help safeguard the long-term investments on behalf of our members. We're in a time of great flux in our financial system. The Royal Commission, the Productivity Commission report, the upcoming federal election, declining trust in some areas of corporate Australia, to name a few, are a potent set of factors buffeting corporate Australia and the superannuation industry. The need for change is clear. An essential component of this is a different and more committed mindset about ESG integration. ESG can no longer be considered a nice to have. That's why ACSI and our members plan to continue and grow our focus on ESG integration. We'll be more demanding, we'll be more vocal, we'll call out poor performers and deficiencies in the system. I'm aware that the thought of investors exercising their rights is a concern for some. Let me allay those fears. The Productivity Commission explicitly and the Royal Commission by implication concluded that the profit to member sector delivers superior investment results for members than retail operations. This reputation was hard won and is well deserved. ESG integration has been a critical component of this success. I think a really powerful point is that those investors who have committed most diligently to ESG integration are the same investors that top the performance tables over the long term. We say in Australia a lot, look at the scoreboard. Well, the scoreboard has demonstrably proven that the profit for member sector is superior to the retail sector in terms of long-term investment performance, and it's that sector that is most committed to ESG integration. So it's not a trade-off, it's not an either-or. One has been a contributing factor to the other. ACSI's motivation in pursuing ESG integration is and will remain to address material financial risks and opportunities. It's important to distinguish what ACSI does from ethical investing. Ethical investing applies ethical or social principles as the primary filter by which investments are selected. This can be a legitimate approach when pursued in the interests of those who make an informed choice about it, but it is not the same as investing through an ESG lens. The difference is that at ACSI we prioritise ESG issues which have the most material financial impact over the long term. ESG is not what other people tell us they want it to be. ACSI will not be pressured to prioritise certain issues. On the other hand, nor will we resile from an issue just because someone tells us we should. Active ownership is the mechanism by which ACSI members undertake ESG integration. It encompasses a range of activities, including voting, engagement, advocacy, and the consideration of the stewardship capabilities of external asset managers. Active ownership is not the same as activism. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Royal Commission reminded us that behaving in a way that is consistent with community expectations is critical. And interestingly, this dimension of community expectations was actually introduced with the level of prominence that it now has by the government when they set the terms of reference for the Royal Commission, which you'll recall was going to be into misconduct of banks, and then it was expanded to include super funds because there's a good opportunity to bang the industry funds. And it was, in fact, about a much broader range of institutions and a broader range of activity. It wasn't just misconduct, it was misconduct and conduct that fell below community expectations. And this issue of community expectations being a driver and a key influence of how all organisations, including super funds, operate is going to be an increasingly powerful influence in the Australian economy and the behaviour of institutions in corporate Australia and in super funds themselves. Millions of working and retired Australians hold shares in listed companies through their superannuation savings. They expect funds to play a leadership role in responsible investment and supporting sustainable businesses as part of our role in generating the best risk-adjusted long-term performance. We accept this mantle willingly because this is our lane. Thank you for your attention. I hope you find the day to be a very useful and stimulating one. I'll hand back to Ali, who's going to introduce our special keynote speaker, who made an incredible contribution in a very influential and powerful role in Australia when she was living in Australia, and has now brought that same power and influence to the global stage. So we're delighted to have her. Thank you very much.